Welcome to Seeking Numina, the Sacred Places podcast. I'm your host, Elise Wells, and today we are joined by Laura Perry, a pagan artist, author, and founder of Ariadne's tribe, an inclusive tradition of Minoan spirituality. Since publishing Ancient Spellcraft in 2001, she has written numerous books, articles, and created works of art, including the Minoan Tarot and the Minoan Coloring Book. Her spiritual practice centers on Minoan spirituality and ancestor veneration, inspired by sacred sites around the world. Learn more at lauraperryauthor.com. And your newest book is The Minoans, which is one of those delightful Moonbooks Pagan Portals guides that just gets right to the heart of the issue. Welcome to Seeking Numina. I'm your host, Elise Wells, and I invite you to connect with the sacred wild within and around you through Numina, or sacred sites around the world, and the wisdom they hold. Together, let's remember the old ways, build relationships with land spirits, and dare to reach out to the fairies. The sacred wild is inviting you to dance in the moonlight. Will you answer their call? Today, I'm really excited to talk about the Minoans. I don't think I've shared enough about it actually on the podcast yet, but I know I shared on social media that I was in Crete this past June studying sacred clay, wild clay. So I really got to know the land of Crete. And as a kid, I got to go to Knossos and see we'll probably talk about that. What may have been a palace, may have been temples, may have been a city. And I actually, for those watching on YouTube, I am holding a replica of the famous snake goddess from Crete. Ironically, I did not get this in Crete. I got this in Corinthos, but it was right after I returned from Crete, and I think I was meant to find her at the end of the journey, you know? So she's here in the interview with us today as well. And yeah, thank you for being here. And I'm really excited to share Crete from your perspective, from the Minoan perspective,
Oh,
with the
thanks so much for
listeners.
having me on here. I'm excited to talk about Minoan spirituality from an animist point of view. That's not an angle that I get to talk about a whole lot, but it's actually very important.
Let's start there. Why is
Okay.
animism something that
Uh,
is important to the Minoans?
Even if you're just looking at Minoan culture and religion from a purely archaeological perspective, you can see how intricately interwoven it is with nature, right? So most people who know a little bit about the Minoans, yes, know that they had these big cities. They were a very sort of urban, high civilization, paved streets, indoor plumbing kind of people. And so people often think of them as more urban, but their religion actually, in addition to the temples in the cities, their religion revolved very strongly around cave shrines and mountaintop peak sanctuaries. So those were like incredibly sacred focal points for their religious practice, to the point that the caves, especially, they even built what we consider to be sort of artificial caves in their temples and some other buildings. They are called adita. They used to be called lustral basins because archaeologists a long time ago thought they were some kind of sunken bathtubs. But they're actually ritual spaces, and we think they may be symbolic caves built into temple spaces. So they brought nature symbolically inside their buildings,
Mhm.
even. So it was that important to them.
I think that speaks volumes to human nature, no pun intended, that when we do evolve into spaces where we can, if we're not careful, be quite separate from nature, it is our tendency, I actually think it's our natural inclination to miss nature and want it back inside. Like even people who don't live any sort of spiritual, existence, they love getting a bouquet of flowers, like there's something to that desire to bring nature inside. Do you
Yeah.
th do you think the Minoans did they do ritual outdoors, or do you think they really did bring it all inside?
Oh no, the art shows very clearly that they did ritual outdoors. Um, there are at all of the temples or cult centers, I guess is a common term for them. They're not actually palaces. The archaeologists these days call them cult centers. So they were like temple and government administration buildings. combined. The art shows that there were large rituals done on the plazas, the west plazas, and possibly also the central courtyards in those buildings. There is artwork of rituals being done in fields full of flowers. The peak sanctuaries on the mountaintops all had plazas in front of the buildings where it is likely that rituals were held. Outdoor spaces were every bit as important to their religious practice as indoor spaces, maybe more so.
And do we have any written record from the Minoans' mouths themselves, like that aren't visitors' perspectives?
No. So the Minoans were literate. They wrote in a script rather unimaginatively called Linear A. It has not yet been deciphered. If you see clickbait articles saying that it has, just ignore them. There's a hard mathematical limit to the minimum amount of text you need to decipher any script, and we don't have anywhere near the amount necessary, and no amount of computers and AIs can breach that limit. So we can't yet read it. They are discovering a few more linear A tablets and inscriptions every year, so the corpus is slowly growing. I have hopes that it will eventually be deciphered. In the meantime, the only written records that we have about the Minoans were written in a script called Linear B that was developed during the Mycenaean occupation of Crete. This script was used at Knossos. It was developed from Linear A, and it was used to keep records. It was also used in mainland Greece at Mycenaean sites there, but specifically in Minoan context, it was used at Knossos. It's accounting, bookkeeping records. And that sounds kind of boring, but if you think about it, this is the bookkeeping records of a religious institution, right? This is a cult center, a temple. And so we have in the records the names of deities that donations and offerings were made to. We have priestly titles. We have names for words for occupations and for the kinds of consumer goods and agricultural products that the Minoans and the Mycenaeans during that era dealt with at Knossos. So we do have some information. It's from the perspective of what was by the end of that era an occupying force. And so it's not necessarily reflective of pure Minoan religion, but it certainly gives us some idea of the kinds of religious practices that were current in the late Bronze Age on Crete.
And there was cultural exchange more than I realized between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, even on the mainland. Like they were,
Yes.
importing funerary, I know box is probably not the correct word, sarcophagi, maybe, but these beautiful Minoan grave boxes. Yeah, they would put the deceased in these beautifully painted, very like iconically Minoan with the art.
Right.
I've also found friezes from cities that have the dolphins, and it's just very clearly it's definitely Minoan. It's not. It's something they clearly admired from Minoan culture and brought over. Do we think that the
Right.
Mycenaeans were they soft imperialists in that way? Like, did they have cultural exchange and it was kind of a natural melding, or is that kind of naive to say and it was very much, oppressive? Like how did they kind of coalesce as that era of occupation happened for the Mycenaeans in Crete?
Well, the Minoan art style was kind of the fashion around the entire Eastern Mediterranean. So Minoan style frescoes have been found in Egypt, in the Nile Delta region, in the Levant, in mainland Greece. That art style it was the fashion at the time or around the entire area. And so that was a sort of pervasive cultural exchange. With the Mycenaeans specifically appear to have borrowed not just the art style, but also a significant chunk of religious iconography. And of course, deities as well, because there are Minoan deities kind of studded like sprinkles on a cake in the Hellenic pantheon. And that's a common process between human cultures, whether they're friendly with each other or not, whether it's, friendly or conquest. There's Religious borrowing is very common. The Mycenaeans and the Minoans probably had very different worldviews, but the Mycenaeans did see a lot of value in obviously many of the things that the Minoans did because they borrowed a substantial amount from writing to religious iconography, a certain amount of technology and that kind of thing. So yeah, there was deep exchange for a number of centuries there.
What makes Minoan what characterizes Minoan spirituality? Big
Um,
question.
Yeah, well, the Minoans were kind of unique. They do appear to. Okay, so let's back up quickly here. DNA research has shown that the Minoans were their ancestors came from Anatolia, modern day Turkey, and they were one of multiple waves of migration out of that area and into Eastern Europe and down into the Mediterranean during the Neolithic. So this is like during 10,000, 9,000 BCE, around the time that agriculture is first exploding, populations are expanding and moving out. And one of those waves of migration came down to the Aegean, and those people settled on Crete. And
Mm.
so they have the Minoan culture doesn't the culture on Crete doesn't become recognizably Minoan like what we think of as Minoan in about the year 3000 BCE. So there's like 7,000 years in there when they're growing from tiny little farms and villages until eventually they have these giant cities. And in that time, they hung on to the religion that they brought with them from the place that they originally migrated from. We do see the big temples and the processions and the offerings that are common in Bronze Age religion, in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So there is a sense in which the form and the trappings are familiar or similar to all the other Bronze Age religions. But there's also a connection back to that Neolithic religion because they have the caves and the mountaintops, boulders, sacred rocks, all of these aspects that hark back to the Neolithic. So it looks like there was a pretty solid underpinning layer in Minoan religion that is from an earlier era that they kind of hung on to. It's likely that the people they traded with and their neighbors around the Eastern Mediterranean kind of thought they were those weird, Orthodox backwards people who weren't quite moving forward with the times as much as everyone else. I would say they were a combination of fusion of the past and the present in the Bronze Age, which sets them apart a little bit from the surrounding cultures.
Yeah, it's a very unique history that only an island as big, Crete doesn't feel like an island. Like you can go most places in Crete and not be able to see the sea, which to me is what makes you feel like you're on an island. And it's
Right.
very so varying. Like when I was with Linda, we would drive not even an hour, maybe 35 minutes, and we would go through different climate zones. Like it would be a solid 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer at some places than where we just left behind. We'll see trees that could never grow over here that we were just at not even an hour prior. How do you think the Minoans, especially if they came from a very different landscape in the far east, not the far east, in the east, in Mesopotamia, Sumeria. How did that changing landscape factor in? What do we know about how that might have factored into their spiritual practices? You mentioned the mountaintops and the caves.
Okay, so the Minoans' ancestors actually came from Anatolia, which is modern day
Right.
Turkey. So that's so you go, it's straight north. If you sail from Crete along the eastern coast of Greece, then you immediately get to the coast of Anatolia. And the Minoans continue to trade with that region all throughout their history. So it's not like they were even separate from it. Archaeologists think that the migration probably took decades, if not centuries. So they would have had time to slowly adapt. Apparently, they brought all of their livestock with them, and I mean, this was like a massive shift of people and their culture. Yeah, Crete is it's in the Mediterranean, and it has the Mediterranean climate, but you're right, it does have these climate zones that are odd for an island. It's the biggest island in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the by the Bronze Age, the Minoans were very much a seagoing island people. I mean, you can tell from their art and from the extent of their trade that that was what they had become. My personal view, no one's really clear on exactly how that migration happened, but my personal view is that and one of the theories that archaeologists have put forth is that it was the migration itself was made in boats.
Mm.
That it was people who had come down to the coast of Anatolia and they ran out of land, right? And they're like, okay, what are we going to do now? And so they would have moved down the coastline in boats slowly over time. So they sort of became a sea people fairly early on, probably moving from one island to another, or, from one stretch of coastline to another. I suspect they were really excited to find such a big island where they could actually like settle and feel solid. But yeah, the whole that whole region, southwestern Anatolia and on down all the way down to Crete is all very much the Mediterranean climate. Southwestern Anatolia is hilly, kind of like central Crete. Not the mountains aren't quite that high, but same kind of same general concept for the terrain. I think the sort of seagoing aspect hit really early on, and that's one of the three sacred realms. When we were trying to kind of reconstruct the Minoan spiritual worldview, we didn't know what to expect, and what we ended up with via a combination of archaeology, dance ethnology, comparative religion, and a whole bunch of meditation and journey work in connection with the deities, we came up with three sacred realms, land, sky, and sea. If you've ever been on an island, you're like at the center of the connection between those three. That's what it feels like. Our interpretation, anyway, of how they viewed the world around them, the world that they were so intricately connected with.
Yeah, and I think of like the way that syncretism must have happened. One of the gods that a lot of people struggle with is Zeus. And if all they know him from is his mythology, of course, not a stand-up guy. You don't want to invite him over for dinner by any means. But, mythology is not theology, and archaeology paints a different picture as well of the different kind of eras that a god might go through. What is Zeus's connection to Kriti? Which it's a good one.
Yeah, actually, that's one that people kind of don't understand. This is a common misconception. So when the Mycenaeans became culturally entangled with the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were a patriarchal culture, so they had male head of households, and typically, a culture's pantheon will reflect the human structure in the society. And so their deities had a male head, which is Zeus. The Minoans appear to have been matrilineal. There is argument about, matriarchy and all that kind of stuff, but just from a purely cultural structure perspective, they appear to have been matrilineal. And so that suggests goddesses at the head of the pantheon. That's how we have reconstructed it. And so when the Mycenaeans began interacting with the Minoans, they went looking for the male head of household, right? Because that's what they're used to. That's their worldview and their paradigm. And they found the god Dionysus. For some reason, they picked him over the other male deities in the Minoan pantheon to be the one that they decided was like the number one guy. In ancient documents, Dionysus is referred to as Cretan Zeus.
Mm.
And this is similar to the way the later Greeks and the Romans would encounter another culture and look at one of their deities and go, oh, yeah, that's the same as our God who has this name. And so they called Dionysus Cretan Zeus. And so if you see Cretan Zeus mentioned in any of the classical era writings, that's the Minoan Dionysus. Over time, the term Cretan got dropped. And so people started talking about Zeus on Crete. Well, Zeus was never on Crete. He's a Hellenic deity. He's from Olympus in the mainland. So that's his abode and his domain. So when you see people talking about Zeus being born in a cave on Crete, that's Dionysus, the divine child who is the son of the earth goddess Rhea, being born in her sacred cave at midwinter. Gee, where do we know a story of a divine child being born to a mother with no father in a sacred cave at midwinter surrounded by friendly animals? Huh.
Huh. I don't know.
Anyway,
That does sound
um,
familiar.
but so that's what that is. And the Hellenic god Dionysus that most people are familiar with, who's from like 1,000 years later, is actually a syncretism of the Minoan Dionysus and a Phrygian ecstatic deity named Sabazios. So,
Oh,
yeah.
very cool. I've never heard
So,
that
yeah,
connection. I've also heard that on the mainland, Dionysios evolves to from Pan, the way that
they are
the
very
wilds
closely
of.
related. Yes.
I don't know that I could give any credit to anyone for this. I think this is something I've just kind of every now and then Dionysios has this way of speaking, specifically him, whenever I'm at sacred sites or he's very matter of fact and like, oh yeah, this is the thing. And sometimes I'll hear it or get that intuition like in a trance meditation, or I'll read something on a museum plaque and just kind of get like his input added to that. And so I really don't know that this is anything anyone could research. I didn't ever even realize that was what was happening. Sometimes I could have sworn to you, I would have like, died on that hill that like, yes, I did read this somewhere. And it's like, oh no, I never actually I did not. But one of the things that I've kind of been led to understand about Dionysius as he evolved on the mainland is as people moved from the wilds, Pan, for those listening, Pan is like the god of the wild. Like he's mostly worshipped in Arcadia. That's where my family is from, actually, in Stemnica. So we have a history of that more wild, ecstatic practice there. Very different from the civilized Olympians that give us tenets for living in cities. And I've kind of understood that Dionysios arose from Pan to help people in this new environment. Like, how do we bring the ecstasy of the forest to Athens? And his connection with wine, I thought, was connected as well because he's giving the people a safer option for drinking water. Because for those who don't know, the ancients weren't getting wasted. They weren't drinking wine. They were always diluting it with water. And actually, intoxication was a failing of the gods. Like it was an anti-virtue. So it was a respect for the revelry, but also the health of drinking wine in a time where disease was rampant in water sources in new cities. And I mean, I think they were much better than Western Europe as far as that goes. They had aqueducts and they were figuring things out much sooner. But yeah, I don't know. I've always kind of had that sort of impression that Dionysios helped people figure out city living.
I can certainly see that in the Minoan pantheon as we have reconstructed it. There are three mother goddesses who have three sons and three daughters.
Mm.
And there are other deities as well, but that's like the backbone of the pantheon. And Dionysus is one of the three sons. We consider the three mothers, Rhea, who is the earth goddess, Tarasia, who is the sun mother, and Posidaia, who is our grandmother ocean, to be the embodiment and divinity of those three sacred realms that I talked about earlier. Their three daughters are Ariadne, Arachne, and Anthea, and they
Mm.
are the expression of the mother's gifts to us. And then the three sons, Toros, Asterion, Korydallos, and Dionysos, are the ones who teach humans how to use the gifts that the great mothers have given us.
Mm.
And so I can certainly see how Dionysus could be in a position of being the one to teach humans how to walk that line between domesticated and wild. Um,
Yes, I like how you
to
said that. Exactly.
Yeah, there's a balance. We need both, right? And the Minoans were extremely domesticated in a certain sense. They had these massive cities with you know, paved streets, indoor plumbing, and all this other kind of fancy stuff. But they also had a very strong connection to the wilderness. We have horned gods and goddesses who show the connection with wild animals like the deer and the ibex in the mountains. And there's a lot of that in the art too. It's clear that the wilderness of Crete was very important and quite sacred to the Minoans.
And I think a lot of people are unaware of this. I certainly was until I went to Crete and heard this from locals. We think of Greece, especially the islands, especially the Cyclades, but Crete as well. It doesn't have a lot of big old trees. And that was unfortunately because of the seafaring culture. The Minoans
Right.
would have looked out at massive, ancient forests, old growth forests we truly could only imagine because they simply do not exist in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I
How do
mean,
you
how else were they going to build all of those ships? Yeah, the whole island would have been heavily forested all the way down to the edge of the farmland at the sort of lowland, the plateaus around the edges of the island were farmland during Minoan times. There are even today remnants of the canals that the Minoans
Oh,
built.
wow.
They dug canals to bring water from the rivers to their orchards and vineyards. But yeah, the mountains were heavily forested.
I just think of that, if you look up pictures of Crete, like try to picture that. That's what we're thinking
Yeah.
it must have been like. Tell people before we wrap up here, most people should know this, but who is Ariadne?
She is the Lady of the Labyrinth. She is the daughter of the Earth Mother Goddess Rhea, along with her brother, the Minotaur, who is a beloved god and not a monster, guides people through the labyrinth, which is both the way that we meet our own shadow and the way that we journey between worlds and between lifetimes. She is a primary player in the mysteries. It is thought that the Minoans had an early precursor version of the Eleusinian mysteries. And what we have reconstructed involves a story centering, instead of Demeter and Persephone, Rhea and Ariadne as the
Hmm.
mother and daughter pair. No abduction involved. Um, Ariadne, as the Lady of the Labyrinth, is also the Queen of the Dead, and she happily, willingly descends to the underworld for a part of every year in order to care for the spirits of the dead. Because Crete is in the Mediterranean, it's the Mediterranean climate, Ariadne spends the summer in the underworld because that is the dead season in the Mediterranean. Except for a few places high in the mountains, you can't grow anything in the summer. You know, it's crispy brown and dry and it doesn't rain. If you want
Yep.
to grow a garden, you plant it in the fall when the rainy season starts and you let it grow over the winter and you harvest in the spring. And so Ariadne spends the dead season of the summer in the underworld. And then when the rainy season starts in the fall, she returns to the world above with the first green sprouts in the fields. She is the embodiment of the grain crop as well, which is a gift to humanity from her mother Rhea. And so there's a sense in which she is our Jane Barleycorn. Um, so she is with us in the world above as the grain grows throughout the mild, rainy winter. And then when it is harvested in the fall, in the spring rather, that is her symbolic death when she returns to the underworld again.
That's beautiful. So I guess the last question is, who do we think this beautiful lady is? The classic Minoan snake goddess, as she is known. Do you have any theories?
Um, it's very difficult to tell in Minoan art whether we're looking at a deity or a human being because they depicted deities in human form. So that could be either a deity or a human priestess. We consider her primarily to represent a goddess that we call the Serpent Mother, the
Mm.
snake goddess, who is a unique. deity. She is not of this world or of the underworld, but of her very own. I'm trying to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound like quantum physics. Um, she wriggles between all the worlds. She is a serpent. We also consider her to be the labyrinth itself, that winding, twisting, serpentine, sinuous path between worlds, between lives. That's the serpent mother. She is one of the more enigmatic figures. Words don't do her justice. She's one of those that you have to kind of experience firsthand.
I like that. I agree. When I walked into Heraklion in the archaeological museum there and I saw her, like I definitely had a like moment and
Yeah.
you have to ground and be like, okay, can't drop to our knees here, but it is something that needs to be experienced. And I feel fortunate because this replica that I have is also a replica of the colors, but it's a
Yeah.
replica of the colors as the archaeologists found it. So I wonder how much brighter and
Oh yeah, because she's Faience, and that fades. Faience fades dramatically over time, so she would have been incredibly bright red and yellow.
red and yellow. What's faience made of?
It is glass-like. It was the only way in that era that they could make a shiny surface. There was some early glass making, usually for like beads, in that era. Like pottery was not glazed yet in that time period, and so its faience is usually on some kind of ceramic base, like a powdered glass kind of surface.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the Sacred Places podcast. I hope if people are called to visit Kriti, they will think a little deeper about what was here before. Is there any final wisdom you would leave people with about sacred Minoan connections you can find on Kriti?
To this day, there are still, well, you can still visit many of the sacred caves. Some of them were even in use as sacred caves well into the Christian era. You can still visit some of the mountaintop peaks, and if you become friendly with the local people, you can find out about sacred trees that are still a thing there. But I mean, essentially, wherever you are, look to the spirit of the place, and listen, because no amount of me or anyone else telling you about it can substitute for actually making the connection yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the reality of sacred land is we can learn that it's there and waiting for us, but we have to go out and find it to really experience its lessons.
Yeah.
Where can people buy The Minoans, your new book, and keep up with all of the work you're doing?
Okay, well, the full title is Pantheon, the Minoans. It's part of the Pantheon series that
Oh,
Moonbook has put
fantastic.
out. Yeah, yeah, there's a whole series. Collect them all.
Yeah.
Um, So it's currently it's available for pre-order right now. I'm not sure what date this podcast is going out, but it'll be released August 26th. Essentially, wherever fine books are sold, you can find all my books on my website, lauraperryauthor.com. I've got links to every imaginable place where you can find them, including all kinds of places that aren't named after uh, a rainforest river. And
Fantastic.
if anyone is interested in the Minoan revivalist spirituality that we're doing, that website is ariadnestribe.com.
Beautiful. And thank you for your work with that because as somebody who's also reviving, I see myself as part of reviving the tradition of the earth priestess arts on the
Yeah.
mainland, really, is where I'm called to work and mostly around Delphi and Vietia in I call it the land of oracles because I've now found 13 oracle sites, most of which
Oh,
are
wow.
unexcavated or were excavated over a solid weekend in the 30s, or one of them 1911 was the last time anyone visited in
Oh,
a professional
man.
capacity. Yeah, so I'm That's why I call it in a more broad sense earth priestess arts. And it's really even priestess. That's just because that's me. But priests, priestesses, it's for everybody. The land has kind of shown me some things and has some opinions, but that's the reality of working with such ancient traditions is you do have to
Yeah.
just experience it. You have to just experience it and ask the gods for advice, ask the land for advice. And thank you for the work you're doing with that.
Happy to be of service.
Yes, yes. Whenever anyone's like, what is a priestess? What does that mean? It means you are of service. Maybe to a certain deity, maybe to the land, maybe to your community, but you are of service. And that's the facts of it. It's a labor of love.
Yes.
Thank you for seeking Numina with me today. Join me at patreon.com/Elise Wells to support this show and get access to a library of rituals, exclusive videos, meditations, and more. To learn more about my upcoming retreats, book a tarot reading, or learn with me in workshops, classes, or mentorship, visit seekingnumina.com.